These are fascinating papers, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So if we can start here.
Thank you. Nasser Kalaoun. Question to Konrad. About 25 years ago, I was in Egypt, and I met a few people that carry the family of Kalaoun. That's my family name. Now, a section of the family, there are not many, but a section is rich, live in Du'i, in Cairo, and a section in Za'azi, in Shar'iyya, who are extremely poor, sell ta'miyya and falafel. Now, after the rich section guided me to go to the poor ones to see for like documentary, whatever, and interest, they produced to me a document which is rolled up, which traces the family tree, the poor section, which goes to from Kalaoun at now and goes back to Baybars, and then goes extremely into fiction and Abu Zayd al-Hilali and and other stuff in there. In other words, it's manufactured. When I got back to Cairo, the rich section of the family, a lady, she was startled. She wanted to see it. In other words, are there anybody to claim for the property and whatever? Because the President Nasser stripped them of many faddans. So anyway, and when she met me at first time, she told me why your father called you after the Harami, President Nasser, in other words. So it tells you, in reality, there are the property, as you rightly alluded, and whatever. With the reproduction and the reuse of documents, is it to, re-grant or remake history, not only on personal sense, but also on political and religious, and do you have any other circumstances to support it? Thank you.
I mean, so far, please say if there's a lot of, so far, I've focused on identifying the legal documents, reassembling them, and basically understanding what's going on that level. And the second level, basically, what is the context of the reuse, what is the materiality of the reuse, is something which I've just started, so I don't have a large amount of different case studies to which I can refer. But it's very clear that, I mean, let's say you could certainly not be that creative in the reuse of documents and completely falsify them and make something up, but that it was quite an important strategy, at least in specific scholarly milieus, which had the possibility to produce writing material, to insert themselves into certain genealogies, to restate their name. And in the example which I showed here, if you open the manuscript on the second page, you have the first half of the first line where it says Ibn Abi Raja. So you immediately see the family and you see the whole point of what is going on here. So that's certainly the main strategy for a specific milieu to claim the prominence in biological terms, which the manuscript itself could only do in scholarly terms.
Yes, I have a question for David Garretson. You were referring to Sakhawi's manual. What's the title of that? I would like to look that up.
That's Fath al-Mughith.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Elias, you had a question? No, then over here.
Sorry? The name again? Fath al-Mughith, Sharh Alfiyat al-Hadith.
Thank you to all panelists for really a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed that and learned a lot. I've got two questions for Daisy in how it links to both papers that preceded and the one that followed. The first is whether you, I don't really know much about Waqf from the legal perspective, and the question really is whether you also see the kind of discrepancy between the theory of how, in this case, istibdal documents or the istibdal procedures should be carried out, and what you eventually see in documents such as these, as we saw in the first case. And the second question, you sort of referred to archival practices and to how documents as archives are very much or look very much like archives of a set of documents. The question that came to mind is that in terms of where are these documents kept, the physical space, do you think of something like the Kubet el-Khazan in Damascus for Cairo, or is there any other kind of institution, that archival institution or anything else that you think of in this perspective, in this respect?
Okay, thank you. They're both really difficult questions. So thank you for that. With theory and practice, I think I haven't really spent ages looking at sort of shurut literature, but what I have looked at, I can't find any theory or sort of models saying that you should add things in the margins, or it seems to me to have been more of a response to practical or to practices rather than a theoretical sort of something from above. But it obviously became very systematic. I mean, the whole corpus exhibits more or less the same features. So it did become theory, I guess. I don't know if that really is answering your question. With Istibdal, I think that my impression from the documents is they often, different documents show quite different series of sort of documentary traces of Istibdal, so they don't all have exactly the same stages. So my impression with that is that sometimes all four of these things that I was talking about appear and sometimes they don't. So my impression with that would be that well, I guess there were some sort of procedures or protocols that had to be sort of or hoops that had to be jumped through, but maybe they're not all visible in documentary terms. The question of where the documents are kept is one that I was obviously deliberately avoiding. The general assumption has been that these documents were kept in the institutions that were endowed or beneficiaries of the Waqf, and I think that there is evidence from some of the deeds that they were indeed kept in the Waqf deeds anyway, were kept in the institutions that they were benefiting. For the sales deeds and Istibdal deeds that then ended up in Waqf, because that's what most of the documents are in the collection, I don't know where they were kept. I'd be suspicious that they were also kept somewhere in the institution or in the household of somebody. I don't think that they were kept in a Geniza-like collection. They're very well kept. Not today, but they're not reused. Often you find scrolls with an entire blank, sort of a foot or 2 foot, 2 feet of blank paper or parchment, good quality paper or parchment. So I feel like if they were in a Geniza-like depository, you probably would find more traces of use for other purposes. Yeah.
Question for Konrad and for Garret. So Konrad, you said that piecing together the answer to the question of where these documents came from for reuse, like how did people get access to them? As far as I understand, you only focused on the depository route. Are there do we have a sense, or do you have an idea of what the other pathways were to gaining access to this kind of material? And do we have evidence for why it was that things got deposited? Was there an understanding that once you deposited certain contracts or certain kinds of documents, that they could one day end up in somebody's hadith collection? Was there an understanding that was a danger, and so you only gave them things that you didn't worry would get out? Or and then for Garret, I understand why somebody would make a record of audition sessions, like in the form of these tibaq. What is less evident to me is why, once you have a manuscript that has all the tibaq at the end, the audition statements, if you were not present at if all you're doing is copying the manuscript and you didn't attend an audition session, why you would then copy all of the tibaq? Because that, I mean, it's not to provide a record of oral transmission. It's actually just to, it's providing, it's an entirely written transmission, but it's maintaining it's preserving the evidence of the oral transmission, even in this period. Do you have a sense of why that was important?
So if I understand the question, you're asking when a copyist makes a copy of a manuscript that has audition notices on it, why does he do that? Yeah. So they talk about this in the protocols, and they mention that, in fact, it's not permissible to copy the audition notices unless you've done a muqabala with that copy. So in a sense, it gives it some kind of authority. That's one aspect. And there's also a kind of barakah, I think, that's associated with that connection to those men and onto the Prophet. I think that's also part of it.
Yeah. Just on that, well, I mean, my feeling is that quite often when hadith manuscripts are copied, that the sama'at are then transferred into the riwaya at the beginning, that they are basically condensed. Sometimes they are copied in full, and that's often when it's very meaningful for the new owner of the manuscript to have a, very prestigious thing going on there. But if it's not that prestigious, they basically just condense it into the title page riwaya and add some more lines, what is going on there. And I mean, according to the Kubra al-Khazna, depository is very debatable. We hardly know anything about what the Kubra al-Khazna is. There's very little material has come out so far. The colleagues who have come closest to it have not been very willing to communicate on the material. So it's very difficult to get our heads around what's going on there. What I believe is that around the Umayyad mosque, there was obviously during the Ayyubid and early Mamluk period also area of legal dispensation, whatever that means, but basically the qadis were around that area and that legal paperwork was produced. And that you also had kind of quasi-archival collections, private collections. And that this material, once it stopped to be of immediate use for actors in the legal field, that they often put it into the Kubra al-Khazna as an in-between solution. I think it was not really a waste paper, that you got rid of it, but not really something which you still wanted to have in your immediate, look at your own office. I don't know how many stuff you got where you think, I could bin it, all the PhD stuff, but on the other hand, you don't really want to bin it, and so you have this cupboard of in-between stuff. And that's how I think about the Kubra al-Khazna. Quite often it was an in-between stage. So that's basically why material was deposited there. And partly it was, and why it was in between obviously has a whole range of reasons. Perhaps people wanted, had the feeling we might go there at some point. Sometimes they might have felt it's quite valuable, it's quite exciting, like the Latin fragments. And if you look at the Latin fragments they chose for producing new manuscripts, it's very clear that they systematically chose liturgical manuscripts with musical notations. That's what they loved. Because obviously there was no musical notation in Arabic manuscript culture, and for them it must have been completely weird to have these dots and scripts and so on. So they went in there, and there must have been a lot of musical Latin liturgical manuscripts in the Kubra al-Khazna which were deposited, because they were considered to be somehow special. Other ways of preservation, that's obviously family archive. I think that's the most obvious thing, that we don't know exactly, and in the publication of the marriage-related documents, they don't say a word on it. Why are these marriage documents in the Kubra al-Khazna? Did they put them there? Did the Qadi put them there? Did the families put them after the parents died? We don't know, what the function was. But for sure, many people also preserve their own paperwork at home, and quite often that's the main way of how paperwork came into the hands of producers of new manuscripts.
Yes, thank you. My question is for Garret. So thank you for your paper, which is clearly based on very meticulous spade work. So my question is, you spoke about the disconnect between the theory of transmission and audition in Ulum al-Hadith works and then the practice. So what does this tell us about Ulum al-Hadith more generally as a genre? So my own impression is that most of it is very idealistic and kind of far removed from actual practice. Does your paper reinforce that impression or complicate it? And what do you think in their own minds? I mean, many of these people, Ibn Salah and others, were involved in transmission and audition. So what were they, when they write in terms of Ulum al-Hadith, what are they, what's their intention there versus when they're actually involved in transmission?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what it says, really. And this is a relatively small sample, less 200 something. I'd like to have a look at a larger corpus and see if it's also, this disconnect is also reflected there. I don't know what else to say to that.
Yes. I have a question for Garret Davidson. I don't know a lot about the transmission of hadith in the Mamluk context and how this worked, but I study the circle of Ibn Taymiyyah, and I recently discovered that if you look at some of its prominent members and you look at what the Tabaqat literature says about the shuyukh they studied with, the sheikhs that are mentioned are often hadith scholars, and they then, it says that they heard hadith from so and so. And I try to compare each individual from the circle and Ibn Taymiyyah himself. Like, what are there any names that consistently come back with each individual, and that they all studied with the same sheikhs? And I found that there is indeed a list of certain hadith scholars that they all heard hadith from. So I was wondering, on the grounds of your research, whether you found that what you discovered in these manuscripts, whether this gives any indication of what hadith scholars were the most prominent in Damascus, especially, because I very much agree with what you said, that Sham and Damascus was the new center of hadith, I think, because the Hanbalis moved from Iraq to Damascus. So I was wondering whether your research, or whether you found any other literature that studies this phenomenon of hadith scholars that were prominent, because I was a bit surprised that there were a lot of names in there that I had never heard of, and sometimes you have this idea that you understand who were the big names in this time, and then I found that none of these names were familiar to me. Yeah. So I was wondering what you can say about this.
Yeah, I think it's important when you're looking at this biographical literature to make a distinction between hearing, hadith, and study. These are often conflated in the secondary literature, and they're distinct things. It's quite rare, actually, in the biographical literature to talk about study. Usually it's sami'a, which is not study. Again, and I think for these Hanbalis, this is part of their piety. I think I get the sense that Salihiyya people are sitting around reading hadith all day. Like, that's what they do. As for the kind of obscure figures, the people who end up transmitting hadith, as I mentioned, are often not scholars. They're people who just happen to hear hadith as children. And again, in Salihiyya, you get the sense that they just kind of dragged kids into the mosque and made them sit and hear hadith. In Ibn Abdul Hadi, his poor children, they were always listening to hadith. So it's those people that end up transmitting hadith, those people that live to old age, and not necessarily scholars.
Next, okay, fine. Well, this is a question for Daisy. It's actually two. One just very technical, and the other a bit more complex. The first is the medium on which these things are written. And it's a term I encountered, and I never heard anyone explain it, but I was wondering if you noticed it. The term warak hamawi, literally paper from Hama, and I would see it as you're aware, the paper is very high quality. Once you get away from the beginning of the roll, the surface is beautiful gloss. It holds ink very well. But I've never heard anyone discuss that term. It's obviously, there's quite a chemistry and everything to making paper like this, and I was wondering if you had encountered, or anyone else who may have looked at these. That's the technical one. The more complex one is this issue of the terminal istibdal. And you mentioned in passing that Kansu Gauri shows up. It's a massive percentage, probably about 80% of those istibdals sitting in the Waqf ministry have it. And the issue, you mentioned cash, but as I notice, when it gets to his, it simply mentions an agreed upon price with no money. And whether this was a massive expropriation, which could have been horrendously illegal, because he's acquiring this massive property. The earlier istibdals mention prices, but his don't. And you can tell these guys must have been copying these things by the hundreds, because it's maybe 3 or 4 quick lines at the very bottom of that whole series of istibdals. So I was wondering about your reaction to that. It was stunning to me when I had no idea before. No one had ever told me about this presence of this massive acquisition of all these properties by Kansu Gauri. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with the kinds of paper, because I don't have an answer to you, I'm afraid. Definitely, as you say, they mention the kind of paper that the documents are written on when they cross-reference documents. Or parchment, I should point out, because, most of the ones from the 15th century or from the second half of the 15th century are on paper, but earlier ones are often on parchment. I don't know about what that means for that specific kind of paper. I mean, I can't enlighten you, sadly. But yeah, it's interesting. As regards Al-Khawri, yes, your writing on this is very important for what I'm looking at right now. I haven't really thought about the issue of price, because I didn't kind of go through the content of documents in massive of detail, because I didn't have time. But from a sort of archival point of view, I think that a very large amount of this material could or should be defined as part of Al-Khawri's Waqf archive, and I think the archive in its sort of shape reflects the way that this sale or expropriation happened. I mean, it must have been that hundreds of documents suddenly came together at a certain point and were updated. And you find actually that the updates, as I'm sure you are aware, a lot of the updates of the sort of final Waqf update are written in the same hand. So maybe 3 or 4 people updated hundreds of documents to say that these properties were now part of his Waqf. So I sort of see, in a way, that this is a sort of archival reflection of the Waqf endowment, in a way. But as for the prices, I mean, it definitely is a bit dodgy. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you all. Those were fascinating presentations. Garret, I just wanted to ask if you could comment any further on any of the corrupt motives that were imputed to people who didn't record all of the names in the sama'. I mean, is there money changing hands here for these sama'at? That's one question. And then for Konrad, I just wanted to ask the hackneyed, uncool question about this general survival of Mamluk documents, and I was struck by the fact that this, potentially, definitely exciting and potentially new source of documents, namely the manuscript reuses that you highlighted, turn out sort of also to come from the Qubbat al-Khazna. I mean, I think as Mamlukists, we always want to discover sort of other new repositories and say, no, there really was a lot more at one point in time. I mean, is it? I don't know. Is it sort of disappointing in a way, or does it affect our general picture of how many repositories there actually were, that the ones you discovered also happened to come from one of the kind of handful of repositories we already know about? Is there a more general point to be made there?
So I can only speculate. They don't elaborate on these motives, corrupt motives. The first thing that comes to mind, these are academics, so there are all kinds of petty jealousies, of course. Perhaps laziness, just not wanting to take the time to record people. Beyond that, I don't know.
You don't know if there was any payment, any money for these?
To record Sama'at, I have no evidence of that. There is kind of forgery of Sama'at that's quite common. And there's a culture of paying people to hear hadith and I guess ultimately record a Sama'at. But that doesn't, I don't know if that connects to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all it's rather reassuring and exciting that it's Kubbat al-Khazna material, because I mean we still haven't really understood the Kubbat al-Khazna, so that we get more material kind of circulating around it rather will enhance the chance that we in some years really understand what was going on there and what its function was. And it's clear that, I mean, for Syria, there's nothing really localized yet. Haram al-Sharif, as we know by now, is rather random survival. It's nothing which tells us too much about archival practices. So the Kubbat al-Khazna, and that's obviously not unique to Damascus. I mean, we have the same for Aleppo, we have the same for Hama, about which we know nothing at all. So if we basically start to look at these Kubbat in one way or the other, I think that, we will get a much better understanding of some kind of paperwork which is there. So in that sense, it's great. Obviously, it's quite disappointing, let's say, that the reuse corpus is matching so neatly with the identified Damascus Kubbat al-Khazna corpus so far, because it only gives us, again, the same documents, but which that tells us is that there must be other spaces within Damascus, at least, where material was deposited. So there must have been somewhere a depository for governance-related paper, which was clearly distinct from the Kubbat al-Khazna, which obviously is the Citadel, is the main candidate for that. So at least, by being able to pin down some documents for the first time in space in Damascus, hopefully will also allow us then to think about the other potential spaces and to dig deeper into how we could get our head around what's going on in these spaces.
Okay, well, the next item on our agenda is coffee. We're 15 minutes ahead of schedule, and I wonder if the conveners want to move up our 11:20 meeting or not.
I think we should just keep on the schedule and have more time for coffee, and questions can be
great. Then
carried out.
11:20. Let's thank the panelists. It's very